And I'd like to welcome you to the Actionable ESG Talks series brought to you by AKFI, the Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first nonprofit industry association committed to bringing together ESG sustainability and digital transformation. Actionable ESG Talk series bring together great minds to discuss the current state and the future state of ESG, sustainability, digital transformation, and AI. I'm delighted to be here with our guest, Professor Carl Rasmussen, and just to go very quickly through a very interesting biography. Carl Rasmussen is the professor of machine learning at Cambridge University, and he's the chief scientist at Secondmind, a machine learning and an AI for Cambridge based engineering company. Carl is also the head of computational and biological learning lab in the engineering department at Cambridge. And before he moved to Cambridge, Professor Rasmussen was a research group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics, now the Intelligence Systems in Tübingen, Germany, and the Senior Research Fellow at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit at the University College London. All the illustrious academic, first-rank academic companies. Carl completed a PhD in computer science in Toronto with Jeff Hinton, Nobel Prize laureate, as we all know, considered the father or the grandfather of AI in physics. And Carl is also the co-author of the award-winning book on Gaussian processes for machine learning, and that was published in MIT Press in 2006. And we promise our audience that we won't go very deep in Gaussian theory or in statistics. So thank you for joining us today, Carl. I'll start with a general sort of trend question about countries working together on climate change separately, and why it's separately enough instead of working together. We talked before we run the camera about the Paris Accord, which is a global accord. So please help us.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Manuel, for having me, and thanks for the long introduction. And yeah, it's a great question. You know, is working on climate change individually by by countries, is that enough, or do we really have to have international collaboration? Yeah, so I think that's a great place to start, because I think one of the things that we haven't quite realized is that really tackling climate change really requires us to work in an international sense. And that's because that in common pool resource problems, the user of the I think of the atmosphere as being a resource that you can use. If you put CO2 into the atmosphere, I think of that as being using the atmospheric resource. You could also think of it equivalently as being pollution, but I think of it as being a resource. The people who use the fossil fuels, they gain all the benefit from using it. But of course, the negative side, or the consequence of having put the CO2 in the atmosphere, is borne collectively by the whole world, right? And because of this asymmetry, the only way in which we can really attack the problem is to think about the problem from an international perspective. So I think in every country, Britain included, we have a lot of debate at the moment about whether we should do the national goal of, for example, net zero by 2050. And I think from an environmental point of view, that question doesn't really make sense in its own right, because what you're really saying is, should we do net zero by 2050 and hope that other people will do the same thing, right? Because if you don't have and hoping that other countries do the same thing, then from an environmental point of view, it'll make only a very, very small difference, right? And my only sort of objection to this thing is that hope is not a very strong motivational thing, right? I think we should do something stronger, a cooperative agreement. Like we should actually formalize that we are both doing our share, right? I will if you will.
And are the COP meetings not targeting to this common framework agreement? And we see it on TV,
Yes,
the politicians meeting, the presidents and so on, prime
absolutely.
ministers
So
meeting.
the Paris Agreement, of course, is an international agreement. The problem with the Paris Agreement is that it's just not strong enough, right? So Elinor Ostrom, in her book about governing the commons, she basically was a Nobel Award-winning economist, and she went around and looked to places where people cooperate about common resources. And she basically interviewed people and asked them, how do you do this? How do you manage this, right? And she has a little list of 5 or 6 properties that cooperative systems have to have, right? And the list is not very complicated. It's transparency, it's commitment, it's trust, it's the ability to sanction countries that don't play along, and there are a few more, right? And if you look at the Paris Agreement, it has none of those. So we know it's going to fail. It's
So it's
not a
no,
good cooperative framework.
it sounds to me that it's a mechanism for cooperation without enforcement or without.
So the enforcement is missing. There's also trust is missing. There's no way to build trust. Actually, there's you. I think the framework sort of builds mistrust in a way that people don't quite believe that other countries are going to do what their projections are, which are far into the future, right? So there's a couple of problems there, and if you really investigate each of those topics in detail, you'll find that they're not really implemented within the Paris Agreement, and we sort of hope that it'll work anyway, right? But that's not very
Hope,
realistic, unfortunately. Yeah.
yeah, hope it's not a policy.
Hope is not policy. No, not on its own. Not on its own.
No. And by the way, I think that this is parallel to the major industries as to individually produce ESG or sustainability reports and adhere to their reports. We studied actually the implication on the supply chain, and we find out that, of course, like as you very well said, environment it's one, right? Atmosphere it's one. Uh, if you have greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it doesn't matter if they are produced in Alaska or Antarctica, they end up to be the same effect. And
Yeah.
the same effect is with companies and their supply chains. The supply chains are crisscrossing the world. And a lot of, I'm sure you know, a lot of the greenhouse gases, for example, are actually accounted for by the suppliers, not by the company itself. And so
Yeah,
when they
that's
set a
right.
net zero objective, it's like they set a net zero objective for their supply chain, not just for themselves. And if it's no execution, if it's no enforcement mechanism, then
Yeah,
it's not going to happen.
yeah, that's right.
So you talked about the Themis mechanism and how could help to help countries on the emission side. And as we discussed until now, how this is different from the let's say the Paris Accord and these multi or international accords.
Yes, so I've come up with what I call the Themis mechanism, and it's supposed to be a constructive way of doing something better. So I think there's a problem sort of on the green movement that a lot of the time it's mostly a protest movement, and I'm sort of very conscious that we also have to be for something. So I'm trying to propose uh, a practical framework which would actually work better than the Paris Agreement. Right? So the Themis mechanism is a proposal for what could we do differently, and it works. It starts from recognizing that we have to share the atmospheric resource. Then the next thing that I think is very, very important is that we have to recognize the fact that the atmosphere the atmospheric resource has value. Right? At the moment, the way that we de facto have implemented using the atmosphere is that everybody can use it the way we want. Right? If I can put CO2 into the atmosphere without cost, right? And if you think of it as being using a resource, then that seems a little surprising. I pay for all other resources, but I don't pay for the atmosphere, right? And that is what drives overexploitation, right? Because we pretend that it's free, we overexploit it, and that has detrimental consequences for the atmosphere. So economists call this unpriced externalities. I think we have to price carbon in the atmosphere. Then there's another principle, which is the principle of urgency. I think it's no good to talk about net zero in 2050 because it's too far away, right? So the Themis mechanism says it's all about the emissions now. It's about this year. And in fact, the Themis mechanism only exists for a year at a time to emphasize the fact that it's about what's happening now. That's important. And the last bit of the prerequisites is that I think the reasonable way to think about the atmosphere is in an equitable way. So that means that the atmosphere, the rights and the responsibilities for the atmosphere should belong to all humans equally. And I think that has very tangible, that should have tangible effects, right? So those are sort of the background components to the Themis mechanism. So what it is, it's a climate club or climate cooperative that every country can be a member of. And it has a price. It's governed by one number, which is the price for emitting a ton of CO2. And the price is fixed for a year at a time. So every country, at the beginning of the year, every country can decide to join Themis or not to join. And what happens if you join is that you then have to report how much CO2 have you emitted, and then you have to pay the cooperative that amount. And what the cooperative then does with the money, it immediately redistributes all of the money according to the size of the population in the membership countries. And now the effect of that is that being a member of Themis, if you are an above average per person emitter, it turns out that it's only the emissions per person that matter at all. It doesn't matter whether you live in a small country or a big country. And if you live in a country which is an above average per person emitter, then you will be a net contributory, reflecting the fact that you use more than your fair share. And if you are a below average emitter, then you will be a net beneficiary of the system, right? And of course, one of the very lucky things in our world is that big emitters are actually very, very highly correlated to be also wealthy countries. And the smaller emitters tend to be less wealthy countries and countries who have contributed less to the climate emergency. And the last thing that happens in the cooperative is that every year the members then vote with an open ballot vote. They vote for what should the price be the next year. And then the sequence repeats itself. Right, but there's no long-term commitments. There's nothing long-term at all, and everything is completely open. It's open what you vote for. It's open which countries are members, and so initially you would probably think that this would start with a quite a modest price, but I think the idea that this organization exists, that countries could choose to be members of, and it'll be known which countries commit to this mechanism or not. I think that would be hugely beneficial. And then eventually, if this was successful, the price could then raise to a high enough value that it would really discourage people from using fossil fuels.
So, of course, you bring a lot of questions and so on in my mind, but before going there for a second, let me see if I understand correctly the framework. So the framework is a cooperative. It's a cooperative voluntary, essentially, agreement.
Yes.
It goes on the principle that the atmosphere is one and shared, and as a shared resource, we should, in order to make the other economic financial systems work, it has to have a price. It cannot be zero price. And if it has a price, it has to be meaningful, right? It cannot be $1 per country or $1 although $1 can be a lot for an African country per capita, right?
This is true, but of course, low-income countries will tend to be net beneficiaries of the system, right? So
So
they would actually
they
be
join with the expectation of benefits, not only the cost.
exactly.
The other thing which is very strong with the idea, I will add actually the atmosphere has multiple economic elements. We extract nitrogen from atmosphere, we extract oxygen, maybe some metal, some rare gases like xenon or helium or so. Helium is not so rare, but so should it have also a cost for the exploitation of these resources? Like you mining a resource essentially, and
Yeah, so
depending.
I think in principle you're right. But the problem is we have a crisis now with respect to particularly CO2, to some degree methane. So I think of it as being, any greenhouse gas would
Sure.
be incorporated in this system. But I also think it's very important in order to be able to roll this out, the mechanism out in practice. I think it's important that it's as simple as it possibly can be, right? Rolling
Sure.
out mechanisms in the real world is politically very difficult. And the more complicated these things are, the more resistance this could possibly create, right? So I've tried to think about what is the simplest possible way in which this could work.
And it's simple and elegant. If I was able to, figure it out in a couple of minutes, I really appreciate the simplicity of and the easy to communicate the principles of the agreement and the framework. Have you socialized it with other people in government, academia, and so on? Did you?
Certainly. Yeah, so I've gone around the everybody in the University of Cambridge who is interested in climate change, and I think the in academic circles certainly the idea has some traction. I have also talked to people who are interested in politics. Now, the main problem in politics is, of course, that most politicians have a very strong national focus, and this proposal goes over and above uh, the national stage, right? So there's a question about how do we do we talk to the real stakeholders, right? So I think you need to get national governments interested in supporting an initiative like this, but of course they can't do it on their own. Right? That's the whole point. So in science, we always like to think about the smallest possible version of a problem, which has the right sort of features, right? And I think, unfortunately, for climate change, the smallest possible unit that makes sense is the global one. Like, so we really have to. There's no national version of this that sort of makes sense.
So, and I'm sure you follow the politics and this discussion about sustainability in the global south, the northern countries, and we see occasionally in the COPs meetings that company and COPs has somewhat a similar idea of a mechanism at rebalancing the financials. But you see the developing countries saying, look, we cannot afford solar panels. We cannot afford changing. We still need to burn fossil fuels and so on. Why you develop country that spent last 200 years uh, pushing this atmosphere resource, right? Pushing it to the limit. Now you're saying we have to be the savers. And I like actually, I'm not contrasting with Themis because I like the fact that it's a much simpler mechanism, right, and doesn't require that. However, I think in the background, on a political level, as you mentioned, there is this thinking of a national element, right? Or at least group of
Yeah.
countries.
So I certainly think that less developed countries would really welcome a proposal like this, right? Because it would actually, there would be a direct economic incentive. And even though they would be net recipients, if they were a member of the Themis mechanism, there would still be pressure on them to emit less CO2. Like it's not only pressure on the big emitters, it's pressure on everyone. If less
So it's
developed
not a
countries,
transfer. It's not a transfer of emission from north
but
to
the transfer
south,
would be
let's say.
even bigger if they were an even smaller emitter, right? So on average, internationally, we emit about 5 tons of CO2 per person over the entire globe, right? But certain countries have much lower emissions than that. For example, India emits two tons per person, right? So, but if they were a member of Themis, they would be net beneficiaries if all countries were members, right? But if they lowered their emissions from 2 tons to 1 ton, then of course they would be even bigger beneficiaries.
Absolutely. Now, you did a very detailed and very insightful and interesting description of the Themis mechanism. Is there an enforcing part? So, you know, maybe in a simplistic way, but where is money, there is a tendency to, round up the last digit kind of attitude.
Certainly. So there's a clear incentive for small emitters to join, but what about the big emitters? Like, why would they join, right? And I think one reason they might join is that they might actually subscribe to the fact that the atmospheric resource should really be shared between everyone, so they would be paying for using this resource, like they pay for other resources, and also it's a credible mechanism that they could buy into because they could understand that if we actually implement Themis, then we will be able to reduce climate change, right? And that'll be beneficial. That'll be beneficial to almost every country on Earth, right? And lastly, I think in reality there might be a few countries who might not want to join either for ideological reasons or maybe they're so reliant on fossil fuels that it'll be economically extremely difficult to join. I think there are a few countries like that, and I think you would probably have to have some sort of mechanism against those countries, for example, trade barriers or something like that. So this is not an integral part of the Themis proposal, but you would probably have to have that, right? And from an ethical point of view, you would say, well, if we subscribe to the idea that we all own the atmosphere equally, then if some countries want to be outside, then they would be taking our stuff, right? And we don't accept that kind of behavior in any other setting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And on the same time, I'm sure that some large countries would look at market opportunities because that will foster a better relationship with the smaller or companies which
Yeah.
are under economic development, right? So they emit less by the nature of their economy, rather.
Yeah. One of the points you said before was also that in the Paris Agreement, there's a tendency for this that the wealthy countries are trying to collect money to help out smaller emitters. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to make it into a mechanism. There's a procedure for why this is happening that depends on your behavior, rather than sort of sending around your hat and seeing how much people sort of contribute,
No,
right?
at the end of every meeting on the Paris Agreement, you see these countries committed XYZ amount of money, and then 6 months later, reporters go and say, well, it's XYZ divided by factor n, which is not a small n.
Right. So I'm advocating for the fact that there should be a mechanism for this instead,
That is
and
exactly.
we
So
shouldn't rely on donations. Yeah.
you including a traceability mechanism into the.
Yeah, so there is already. So one of the things that the Paris Agreement has done really well is, of course, that there is a reporting system, and so I would adopt the reporting system which already exists within the UNFCCC and use that to base the emissions on. And of course, there are some things that are maybe not ideal or not completely clear, but by and large, I would adopt that system and not create something new.
And it looks to me that there are interests on both sides of the different interests, like it happens in business, but there are in the same time reconcilable interest between the developing countries, the recipients of the investment in atmosphere, and the consumers, right?
Yeah. So I think if you at least if you look in the little bit longer term, then we essentially have the same interest, right? All countries have an interest in climate change not getting completely out of hand, right? And that's the level at which we should think about cooperation from that perspective.
In in AKFI, we have interns that help us, and they mostly Gen Zers and younger people, not quite Gen Alpha yet.
Mhm.
And you hear immediately the difference when you talk with them. The way they talk about sustainability is the difference between, let's say, a rational, methodical engineering or academic kind of approach, and it's like, guys, this thing is serious.
Yeah.
I, I sort of don't care that you think it's serious or not. This thing is happening, and
Yeah, so it's extremely serious especially for young people. And I'm old enough that, uh, when it gets really bad, I'll have the advantage that I'll be dead, right? But young people don't share that advantage with me, right? And yeah, this is very real.
quote,
Yeah,
unquote advantage. I'm not sure if it's it's something I subscribe to, but we'll leave it for a next meeting, next
yeah,
time we talk.